Hey, what's going on? It's Andre Della Monica here, and it's time for the MEM Xperience podcast. And today we're going to talk about very exciting stuff again. We're going to talk about the drivers and firmware management with Intune. And for that, I have a very special guest to cover this with me here today. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me, Andre. Hey, everyone. My name is Nir Froimovici. I am a program manager in the commercial servicing and intelligence team at Microsoft. And my team builds the deployment service for driver and firmware servicing for our enterprise customers.
Excellent. So excited to have you in the podcast today, Nir. So excited with the work that you and team are doing there. So I'm dying to talk about all of the stuff that you guys are building right now. So, but before we go there, how did you join Microsoft?
Yeah, so I left Israel 20 years ago and I moved to New York to go to college. And after I graduated, I actually got a job in New York in the financial industry. But then a year later, I got an offer I couldn't refuse from Microsoft. And 15 years ago, I moved to Seattle and I have been with Microsoft for the past 15 years as well.
Nice. Excellent. That's awesome. Great city to live in, Seattle for sure. I lived in Seattle as well. It's a great place to be in. Beautiful, etc. Right. So let's then start talking about the great work that you and team are doing on drivers and firmware management. So the first question that I have for you is how the drivers, right, OEM drivers make to the Windows Update service.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share a diagram that I also included in my Ignite session. There are hundreds of hardware ecosystem partners, OEMs and IHVs, and they build and publish driver and firmware updates all the time. And so if you're not doing ongoing servicing, you're not benefiting from this influx of updates that is coming on a regular basis. So here's an overview of how that happens. Well, first of all, we have the Windows Update service, and you can see that there are already some drivers that are hosted in it, and I denote those with the .sys files. And you can see also that there's this gear that represents the logic in the Windows Update service to deliver the right driver update to the right device. So now that we've kind of have our Windows Update service, let's introduce our publishers. So IHVs and OEMs, they publish driver and firmware updates to the Windows Update service. They use the hardware dev center. If you think about it, driver and firmware updates are just content to be published to the service, and someone builds that content, and those are the IHVs and OEMs. Now, they build those drivers, and then they use the hardware dev center to certify and sign those drivers so that they actually run on the Windows OS.
Cool.
And then through the hardware dev center, they publish those drivers to Windows Update, and they include specific targeting levers that know to identify individual hardware components and individual systems.
Cool. Excellent. That's
awesome. And so now, just to kind of complete the picture, right? The reason that IHVs and OEMs publish drivers and firmware updates to Windows Update is so that on the other side, we have over 1 billion Windows devices that scan that service, the Windows Update service, on a nightly basis and install any drivers. And the way that that works, that scan triggers that logic that I talked about. The best drivers for that device are identified, and then they're being offered to those devices, and then the devices install those drivers.
I see. Great. I think that's a great level set of how how the solution works today, right? And I have some questions for you that I'll be asking in a few minutes. If there's any changes that you guys are planning to make into that particular process when evolving this right through drivers and the firmware service that you guys are introducing. That's great. That's great level set. Thanks for sharing that. So I have another question for you. Actually, I have a bunch of questions for you, if that's okay.
Of course. That's why I'm here.
What we offer today with the driver management solution.
Yeah, so I actually have another diagram that I want to show you, but before I move on to that diagram, I want to talk about where we're definitely not providing driver and firmware servicing capabilities. And that is specifically for ConfigMgr customers that are using WSUS as their update repository. So, admins are familiar with WSUS. They sync all sorts of update classes to WSUS. And then they point devices within their on-prem infrastructure to scan against WSUS. The problem with drivers in WSUS is that there's no ability to say sync a certain class of drivers, like just maybe firmware updates or just graphics drivers. WSUS only supports a full sync of all the driver and firmware updates that exist in the Windows Update service. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of updates. And so ConfigMgr actually blocks that capability because of performance issues. And so if you're a ConfigMgr customer using WSUS, you effectively cannot use WSUS for driver and firmware servicing. And then you need to rely on, word of mouth, specific relationships with IHVs and OEMs. You have to deploy their updaters on all your devices. And it basically creates a parallel servicing kind of like control panel for you as an IT admin. It's like double the work, basically. And so let me kind of start just with that. Now, I do want to switch now to the diagram, and I'm going to show you what capabilities exist today for cloud-connected devices and for admins that manage those devices through Intune.
Sure.
So let's go ahead and transition to that. Okay, so let's take a look at how driver and firmware servicing works today. Like I said, ConfigMgr customers don't really have those capabilities. So I'm gonna bring back this diagram that we just created that shows how drivers make it to Windows Update, and I'm gonna modify it so that it's relevant to what we're talking about now, which is what driver firmware servicing capabilities exist for IT admins. So let's go ahead and get rid of IHVs and OEMs.
Sure.
Excuse me. And then also let's go ahead and change these 1 billion Windows devices only to the devices in the enterprise that are scanning the cloud.
Sure.
And now let's go ahead and introduce our IT admins. So the first thing to notice is that I kind of created a box around the IT admins. And the reason for that is when IT admins manage driver and firmware updates for devices in their enterprise, when those devices scan the cloud, they don't interact directly with the Windows Update service. What they do instead is they interact with Microsoft Intune, and they set a policy in Intune, and that policy is then set through a CSP on each individual device in your enterprise. And so that's basically a client policy is like a reg key value that sets your intent. And in this case, the intent says, hey, I want to get driver and firmware updates when you scan the cloud. Now, the way that actually makes it to the cloud, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change here this device scan. I'm just going to say that now it includes the policy. So this policy that admin set on devices then gets included in the scan. And so when those devices scan, again, our logic identifies any driver that is applicable and good for those devices, they get offered and they get installed. Now, the one thing that I want to call out here is that this control here, it's kind of like an all-in or all-out control. You don't have control over any individual driver, and you don't have control over any of the timing of offering of drivers. And remember, we just talked about how IHVs and OEMs, they just publish drivers on a regular basis throughout the year, and there are hundreds of them, hundreds of partners who do that, and also hundreds of publishing events. And so this control gives you the ability to open the door to all driver or close the doors. But if you open the door, you don't really know when a driver is going to show up on your device.
Exactly.
And you can't control which drivers show up on your device.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point, Nir. And I think to add on kind of the current solution today, right? So one of the key points there as well, especially for SCCM customers, is the fact that they have to add drivers during a OS upgrade, for example, right? Or when they're provisioning a new device to their users, etc. So there's not a lot of flexibility for them to do this outside that process, right?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, right? So, there's a reason why I'm showing the current capability today with the Windows Update service, the cloud service in the center. ConfigMgr admins have the ability, if they wanted to either deploy multiple updaters for the different hardware components and OEMs that they have in their enterprise. And in fact, they do that. They also have the ability to treat driver and firmware updates as third-party updates that get deployed ad hoc. But the reality is exactly what you said. Admins find it very difficult to find out, which drivers should I install for my devices, and how do I know that there's a new update that I actually need versus not need? And so they end up really delaying driver and firmware servicing until they absolutely have to. And more often than not, that happens when you upgrade the OS in your enterprise. And we all know that feature updates or upgrades happen fairly infrequently.
Right.
Because of the magnitude of the task.
Right, for sure. No, this is a very good point. Very helpful. I think one of the reasons I wanted to kind of highlight the current limitations today, I think it's way easier for people to understand the awesome work that you and team are doing now to solve those limitations, those problems that we have today, right? So with that in mind, then, why all that said, right? So why you've been working so hard in making drivers and firmware management through Intune better, Nir?
Yeah, so one of the key points that we started with at the beginning is that ongoing servicing leads to ongoing security and functionality, right? And so now that you understand that driver and firmware updates continuously flow, we can briefly talk about security incidents, right? We're all familiar with some, global security incidents that hit the world, basically, right? Of Windows computers.
Absolutely.
And the mitigation of those issues, more often than not, is with driver and firmware updates. And if you're an IT admin or if you're an enterprise where you don't have established servicing practices for driver and firmware updates, you really need to scramble at the time that you need the most to act fast and mitigate those incidents. And so that would be one of the primary reasons that I would say IT admins would benefit from engaging in more ongoing servicing and of driver and firmware updates. Now, the problem is that if you don't have control over when content gets deployed to your devices, and there's no way for you to know how does that content going to impact my devices,
exactly.
And also, how can I coordinate that content deployment with other updates or other key events that are happening in my industry or in my enterprise internally? Every IT admin knows that that's a big problem.
Absolutely.
And so that has been a major blocker also. Not the only one for sure, but it was a major blocker for people to move away from ConfigMgr and on-premise and to adopt the cloud more and more. One of the friction points is, hey, I really want to get driver and firmware updates from the cloud, but I need to have more control over when they come down, and I need to be able to deploy them in the same way with the same servicing paradigm philosophy that I apply to any other update that goes to my devices. And this is for cloud-connected devices. Now, going back to ConfigMgr customers, they literally have no capabilities. They are
exactly.
Forced to do that more often than not when they upgrade the OS. And by the way, there's weeks, if not months, of testing associated with
That's a good point.
identifying those drivers and making sure that those drivers work well with your line of business applications and with the next version of the OS on the current hardware that exists in the enterprise. And so, really talking about all the benefits of adopting the cloud and all the benefits that you get from that. But that also means that we need to give you the same level of control over driver and firmware updates as you have already for other Windows Update and other content.
Do we want to show a demo right now for that? Or you have anything else?
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll transition to one other diagram is going to give you the context for the demo that you're going to see.
Oh, perfect.
And then we're going to transition to the demo, and you'll see how driver and firmware servicing, you'll see the basic capabilities that we're demoing in Intune and what's coming to Intune.
Excellent.
All right, so just as a refresher, before I give you the context of how the new deployment service works, just a quick refresher of how it works today. If you remember, IT admins use Microsoft Intune to set policies on devices, and then devices send that policy when they do device scans from the Windows Update service, and then all and any applicable drivers are offered at that time and get installed on devices. So with that refresher, let's move on and see how the new deployment service works, and then we'll see a demo.
Excellent.
So first of all, I have my Windows update with the deployment service now. It's the same Windows update with the drivers hosted on it with the same logic that identifies this out. Bringing the actors back in, we still have the IT admins using Microsoft Intune to manage their driver and firmware updates, and we still have your enterprise devices that will scan the cloud on the right. Now, notice first thing that there is no box around the IT admin, and that's because, as you will see shortly, we've integrated the management of driver and firmware updates to the Windows Update service itself. And so the way that happens is IT admins are going to create driver update policies in Microsoft Intune, and they're going to assign those policies to groups of devices in their enterprise. So let's say you're going to start with your pilot group and you want to be able to approve drivers for your pilot group so that you can see how the driver installation impacts those devices before you go and deploy it to the rest of your enterprise.
Sure.
So let's see kind of like what happens when one of those devices that belongs to a driver update policy scans the cloud. Let's see what happens. So the device scan triggers the logic, and you can see that the two drivers that I kept showing in my other diagrams, they're denoted by A to mean that they're applicable to those devices. So if you had the current capabilities policy in Intune, these two drivers would just be offered in response to this device scan. But because this device is now part of a driver update policy that uses our new deployment service, the scan results are sent all the way to Intune. And then IT admins have the ability to browse those drivers in Intune. You'll see the driver name and date and version. You'll see the manufacturer, the driver class. You'll be able to really know what driver it is that you're potentially approving.
Sure.
Now, at that point, you'll be able to make approval and scheduling decisions on a per driver basis. So let's kind of like explain what happened here for a second. First of all, you can see that I only applied the check mark to one of the two drivers, not both drivers. And then only at the right time, and the right time being when you, the IT admin, decided that you want Windows Update to start offering that driver, do we communicate that approval to the Windows Update service itself. And so the Windows Update service is now aware for your specific device what the device ID is with an AAD ID, and also what is the driver that is approved for that device.
Okay.
And so when that device scans next, the logic runs, it identifies that there are two drivers that are applicable to that device, but they recognize also that there's approval associated with just one of those drivers. And so only that driver gets offered and gets installed on the device. And remember that that approval is in place at the time that the IT admin determined in the Intune portal. So you truly get full control on a per driver basis for the devices that you select for approval and scheduling of drivers.
This is fantastic. I mean, that's kind of the part that really, it's very exciting for me. Like having the ability to control things on a per driver basis, it's fantastic, right? It's super exciting.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about that as well. And we're also excited to expand the Windows Update service to also include built-in commercial controls for our enterprise customers.
Oh, okay. That's awesome. Well,
yeah.
What's like, you have an example like of a possible control there?
Oh, the control would be the approval and scheduling.
Oh, the approval
and
scheduling. Okay, yes. Okay, awesome.
Now, I think that we can show the Intune demo now, just so that you see how do I create driver, the IT admin, create driver update policies in Intune, and how do I browse those drivers, and how do I make approval and scheduling decisions with this context in mind. And then after the demo, we should talk about hey, this is Microsoft Intune. It's not ConfigMgr, and this is Windows Update. It's only for devices that scan the cloud. Sure. So what about ConfigMgr customers? So let's talk about that after the demo.
Excellent. So yeah, big thanks for Ted Martin for doing this demo. He did a great job. Let's just run it.
Okay, so here you can see that I'm logged into Intune, and I'm on the devices page. And on this devices page, you can see down here, there's a dashboard that shows me some information about the policies that I've created to manage driver and firmware updates. And you can see that I actually have a policy here with new updates that I can go review. And I can click here to get there, or I can go over to this section over here, and there's another link for the driver update policies. So I'm going to click on this and go to the list of update policies that I've already created. You can see that I have one here. It's called My Policy 1. It's a manual policy, and I'll explain what that is in a couple minutes. You can also see how many devices are assigned to that policy and how many of those devices are reporting their Windows Update scan information to the service as of this date here. And you can see that there's actually 3 new updates that are available for me to go review. So we're going to check that out in a couple minutes, but first I want to show you how to create a new policy. So I'm going to come over here and click on Create Update Policy. And the first thing that we want to do is actually create a name for this policy. So I'm going to call this My Policy 2. And I'm going to click on Next. And now I get to choose the type of policy. And so there's 2 types. There's automatic and there's what we call manual. When you choose automatic, what this does is that whenever a driver firmware update becomes available for any of the devices in this policy, Windows Update will automatically approve those driver or firmware updates to be delivered to those devices. And you can set a deferral period so that if you want them to be delivered a few days after the driver firmware update becomes available, you can do that. The nice thing about using this functionality within Intune with our new deployment service is that if there is a driver that is causing issues in your environment, you'll be able to go in and suspend the approval and prevent that driver update from being offered to any other devices. That's a capability that our current tools do not offer today. So if you're interested in just having drivers mostly flow to devices and just have a way to stop drivers that maybe are causing an issue, then this would be the right option for you. If, on the other hand, you want to explicitly approve any driver firmware updates to be offered to your devices, you would choose the manual option. And so I'm going to show you how to create a policy that does that. So I'm going to go ahead and click here on Deploy Only Approved Updates. Now, I could opt in for notifications when new updates become available, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'll go ahead and click on Next. The next thing that I'm going to do is select scope tags. This allows me to have role-based access for this policy. I'm going to go ahead and choose the Redmond scope tag and select, and then I'm going to click Next. Now I get to choose the groups of devices that I want this policy to be assigned to. And so the way that I do that is I come here and click on Select Groups to Include. And this shows me all of the Azure Active Directory groups that I've created. Now, a recommendation for this driver and firmware update management solution is to create AAD groups of computer models that are the same or similar. If you do that, what will happen is that for each policy, the number of drivers will be a little bit easier to manage, because when you have similar computer models or the same computer models, they tend to receive the same sets of drivers, driver updates. And so it just makes the management of those driver updates a little bit simpler. You don't have to do it that way, but that's what we recommend. So here I'm going to select this AAD group that we've created called Workplace All Contoso Devices. That's the only group that I want to have this policy apply to, so I'm going to go ahead and click Select. And now you see that it's there, and I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And so now I've made all of my configuration settings, and I review those before I actually create it, just to make sure that I got everything the way that I want it, and everything looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. If I wanted to, I could go back and change things, but this looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and create it. Now you can see that that policy shows up in my list here. And you can see what type of policy it is. You can see that it applies to 1,098 devices. And you'll see here that the number of devices reporting is currently 0%, and that's because we just created this policy. Now moving forward, as these devices start to scan against Windows Update after the policy's been created, they will start to report their results to the service, as Nir showed you, and this number will increase. And then we would expect that you should start to see new updates become available. And so now what I want to show you is how you would go and review and make approval and scheduling decisions about updates that are available. So we've got this existing policy that has all of its devices reporting their Windows Update scan information, and there are 3 updates available. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this button to go see those updates. Now what that did is it took me to the details page for my policy 1. And here I can see all of the drivers that are applicable and available for the devices that are in this policy. And you can see that I've actually already approved 2 of these drivers. Now the information that we have here to help you make approval decisions is the driver name, the version, the date that the driver was created, the hardware partner who created the driver, and the class of driver. You can also see how many devices within the policy that driver is applicable for, and you can see how many devices, how many of those devices have installed it. Now if I want to make an approval decision, the way that I do that is I come over here, and let's say I want to approve this display link driver. I'll go ahead and click on this button, and I get this flyout over on the right side here that again shows me some information about the driver, says that the driver is available, and I have the option in the action drop down to choose to approve this driver. So I'm going to do that, and now I get to choose the date on which that approval takes effect. Now today is the 12th of February. I would like this driver to start being offered to devices tomorrow, so I'm going to go ahead and choose February 13th. Now what this is going to do is these 991 devices for which this driver is applicable, when they scan Windows Update after this date, so starting tomorrow, whenever these devices scan against Windows Update, this driver will start being offered. And that's what I want, so I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now you see the notification that that approval has been saved and noted, and it also shows up here that you can see that it's approved. And of course, none of the devices have installed it yet. That will start to happen as they begin scanning tomorrow. Now let's say that for some reason you have a driver that you've previously approved and you want to suspend the approval. Maybe, for example, a driver has only installed on a few devices and you want to go make sure that it's working well in your environment. So if you look at this Realtek driver, you can see that it's only been installed on 5% of the devices. I'm going to go ahead and click here to get this flyout, and it shows me again here how many devices have installed it. I can see that this was approved yesterday and deployed yesterday. That makes sense that not all of the devices have installed it yet. And I'm going to go ahead and suspend this approval by clicking on this drop down. Now as soon as I click save here, what that's going to do is the remaining 592 devices that haven't received it are not going to get that driver when they scan against Windows Update the next time, so long as this approval is suspended. So I'm going to go ahead and click save, and now that approval is suspended, and it's noted here, and you see the notification up here as well. Now let's say that I go and do investigation and I figure out that that Realtek driver is actually working well in my environment, and so I'd like to reapprove it. The way that I would do that is I'd go and click on this link again, and I get the flyout, and now I have the option under the action drop down to restore the approval, which I'm going to do, and I'm going to choose the date on which that approval restoration takes effect. I'm going to go ahead and click today because I'm confident that this driver works well. So February 12th, I'm going to select that as my date. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and now you can see that it's approved again. So that is how you would approve a driver, and also a way that you would suspend an approval and then restore an approval. So now I'm going to go back and look at my list of policies, so that I can click up here on the breadcrumb and I can see the 2 policies, and you notice that where it used to say that there were 3 updates available for this policy, now it says that there are 2 because I approved one of the 3. And I can go and make approval decisions on those other 2, which I'll do at a later date. So this is just a simple way of showing you how, with this new deployment service that's available in Intune, you can identify the drivers that are applicable and available for your devices, and how you can easily make approval and scheduling decisions using this new service.
I have a question for you following the demo, right? let's say my understanding is that the suspend option there that you have is one of the actions. You can suspend devices that didn't install or didn't seek for that particular driver yet, right? Let's say there's 1,000 devices as part of that policy, 500 reached that policy, install the driver, great. And then if I want to suspend the next 500 devices, I can use that function, right? To just suspend it. The other 500 are not going to get the driver. But what if I wanted to roll back a driver that was installed and my device is causing problems that I wasn't prepared for?
Yeah, let me just say a couple more words about the suspend action,
Sure.
and then talk about rollbacks. So first of all, once you approve a driver in an update policy, that driver is immediately approved for, I'm assuming immediate approval and not scheduling for the future. But if it's scheduling for the future, what I'm saying applies as well at that date. Once you approve a driver, the approval gets recorded in the Windows Update Service for all the devices that are covered by the policy. And remember that devices scan every about 24 hours, right? And so there's a high likelihood that, within 24 to 48 hours, all of the devices in your policy have scanned, and at which point they're going to be offered the driver and install it. And so you want to keep that in mind when you think about suspension decisions. Suspension decisions need to be made fairly quickly. And really what we recommend for the same risks that you mitigate with a suspension action is that you have multiple policies for your different rings. So definitely approve for your pilot ring first and make sure that the behavior is as you expect. And then you have the confidence to go and approve it for the rest. When you hit suspend on a driver in Intune, we then very quickly, within, I don't want to commit to a certain SLA here, sure, but let's just say within an hour, the Windows Update Service does no longer have the approvals for any device that hasn't already received that driver. If the device scan that already received that driver, the suspension is moot, basically, because the driver has already been offered to that device. And so that kind of brings us to rollbacks. And this is a question that a lot of people asked us, right? Exactly. And so let me first be really transparent and say, with our first version that we're rolling out, we're not going to have a built-in rollback capability. But let me tell you why I feel that was the right decision for our very first version, sure, and how the existing capabilities mitigate scenarios where you would need a rollback functionality, right? A lot of examples that I hear from IT admins, like, hey, there's this driver that got rolled out. It immediately rolled out to every device in my enterprise, and it's causing some issues. Mm-hmm. And now I have to go and I have to roll it back for all the devices in my enterprise. And I don't really have a mechanism to do that very easily. We do have a rollback capability for feature updates, but we don't really have that for drivers and firmware. And so it becomes a huge pain, both for the IT admin who operationally needs to go execute on that, but also to users who probably need to wait longer, sure, end users who need to wait longer until that actually happens, right? And so part of the benefits of having approval and scheduling control over any driver update that or firmware update that goes out to your devices is that you're able, again, to use that pilot. You're able to stagger the deployment by scheduling the approval across multiple devices, across multiple driver update policies. And so now if you run into oh, wow, I need to go and roll back the driver, you only need to do that to your pilot group, maybe to your ring 1 group.
Good point.
And you're actually not approving it for the rest. Now, that is not to say that we don't recognize that this is a capability that we need to bring to IT admins, and we're thinking about how can we implement that capability into the deployment service for future release. And so don't think that we're not thinking about that or that we're not going to get there.
Sure.
I just don't have an update today on when that's going to happen.
No, absolutely. I think you said really good things here, and the fact that you're acknowledging here that that's something that's in your mind, is your radar, right? I think that's great, right? Thanks for the transparency there. This is awesome. So you said you wanted to cover something for SCCM customers. I'll let you talk about that as well.
Yeah. So actually, I have one more thing that I want to cover.
Yeah, please.
before we talk
Absolutely.
about how do SCCM customers gain access to all the goodness that we're building into the Windows Update Service in the cloud, into Intune. And just a short word about another hot topic for IT admins, which is firmware updates. So first of all, I think it's really important to call out that I use the word drivers a lot, but I only use the word drivers as an abbreviation to drivers and firmware. Really, whenever I say drivers, I also mean drivers and firmware. And even though drivers and firmware, they're different types of updates, when they are published by hardware ecosystem partners to the Windows Update Service, the way that they're published, the way that they're targeted, and the way that they're delivered by the Windows Update Service to devices is the same for driver and firmware updates, which is using the hardware ID components that identify hardware IDs, which is using the computer hardware IDs that identify specific systems. And so this is why the deployment service that we built actually works for firmware updates in the same way that it works for drivers. However, as a lot of IT admins know, there's kind of like two issues that come up that IT admins ask about a lot, right? I would actually say like three issues, or three points of question, right? Sure. Number one is, hey, do I have all my required firmware updates in the Windows Update Service? And that is a good question. OEMs have the final say whether they're going to publish firmware updates to the cloud, to the Windows Update Service, using the targeting levers that I just talked about through the Hardware Dev Center. Some OEMs choose also to publish certain firmware updates only through their updaters. Those updates never even make it to the Windows Update Service. And so let me just say that if an update is not on the Windows Update Service, you cannot use the deployment service to control it. And also that Microsoft, has been collaborating fairly closely with our top OEMs and IHV partners to start shifting the paradigm of how do we get all those updates, all of them, to the Windows Update Service. And I'm hoping to maybe come back again in 6 to 9 months and talk to you about all the publishing practice changes and the Hardware Dev Center investments that we're asking for and planning for. Absolutely. To kind of like change that, right? And so that's kind of like point number one. Point number two has to do with BitLocker. A lot of firmware updates, they don't play nice with BitLocker, or at least that's the experience that admins have. And the reason for that is actually any driver that is published to Windows Update could work seamlessly with BitLocker, but it really depends on the PCR value of encryption that you use when you configure BitLocker. And this is something that is affecting more older devices and older versions of Windows 10. So it's a diminishing problem. Sure. But it's also an education problem. And so I'm not going to go into all the technical details here, but at the end of this, or at some point during this podcast, we're going to share the blog post link, the AKMS, and you can sign up for our engineering neighborhood, where we have a community of now hundreds of IT admins who signed up for the preview and who are engaging in all sorts of topics. And one of the topics that we're going to talk about is education over, hey, how do I configure my BitLocker? How do I identify the devices in terms of OS version or hardware makeup, where firmware updates could be approved and scheduled through the Windows Update Service.
That's great.
Seamlessly.
That's very great.
And then the third issue or challenge is BIOS passwords. And again, it has to do with firmware updates and how do you manage BIOS updates. And again, join our engineering neighborhood, and we're going to talk to you about some best practices and educate you on that. So I just wanted to touch on that because I know it's really important for admins. It came up a lot of questions.
For sure.
And so now I can talk about, hey, I'm a config manager admin. Yes. How do I benefit from this? Because my devices scan WSUS. They don't, in fact, scan Windows Update the cloud.
Exactly.
And so I'm going to talk about this thing called co-management. If you're a config manager customer, you're probably familiar with co-management, which is your ability to, within config manager, to pick certain workloads that pertain to certain update classes. And you can share the management of your devices between WSUS and ConfigMgr and Intune. This is why it's called co-management, because for some updates you're going to get from WSUS and some updates you're going to get from the cloud.
Right.
And for those of you who are familiar or looked into it, you know that currently when we talk about Windows updates, and so security updates, drivers and firmware, feature updates, the class of updates that pertain to Windows. So for example, I'm not talking about Office that has its own co-management workload if you're interested in that.
That's right.
There's this one workload. And if you take advantage of that workload, sure, you're going to benefit from everything we have in the cloud, but we're also effectively forcing you to start doing security update and feature update servicing from the cloud. That lift and shift operation is a deal breaker and a no-op for a lot of IT admins off the bat.
Yes. And it's also near, right? I don't know if you agree with me here, but it's also, I'm sure they agree, but it's also more like a journey, right? They want to be there. They want to do things from the cloud, but like it's a journey, right? It's not something like, oh, let's do it right now. And yeah, we're good. We just switched to the cloud. We're good, right? It's a journey.
That is exactly right. And the journey really has like two parts to it, right? Like part number one is, well, if I'm going to have my devices start scanning the cloud, there's some infrastructure changes that I need to put in place. And then, part number two is like, I need to have the same ability to execute on my servicing paradigm and philosophy on the cloud as I do in ConfigMgr. Sure. And ConfigMgr customers know that ConfigMgr is amazing. It's so diverse, and it allows for some pretty cool, complex servicing paradigms. Absolutely. Task sequences is a great example for like how flexible that can be, right? And so you want to adopt the cloud, and there's lots of benefits for that. But for example, until we don't give you the same capabilities for feature update servicing or quality update servicing or security update servicing in Intune in the cloud, you kind of don't want to go and make that move.
Yeah.
And so what we did in thinking about how do we make this driver and firmware servicing capability available for ConfigMgr customers, we collaborated closely with another guest in the MEM Xperience from the past. Her name is Arya Carly. Yeah. A lot of you probably know her because she blogs a lot, and she is the face of Windows Update for Business.
She's great, yeah.
And Arya helped us implement a new set of dual scan capabilities that are coming soon. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And those dual scan capabilities would enable ConfigMgr customers to turn on the cloud scan just for drivers and firmware. And so all your other content, remember, you're not getting drivers and firmware anyway from WSUS today. So all your servicing could stay exactly the same as it is right now. You can turn on this like dual scan for driver and firmware updates, and then you gain access to everything that we just showed today. And again, nothing gets offered, even though you scan the cloud, because of that designation for drivers and firmware.
That's right.
You're only going to get things that are approved. And so you have the ability now to start only with your pilot rings and schedule when you want that to happen, and so on and so forth. And so a couple things about this new capability or this evolution of co-management that's coming. First of all, in terms of when it's going to be available to everyone, it's going to happen in around midsummer.
Okay.
So I'm not, I'm going to say midsummer now. Again, join our engineering neighborhood, and you'll have access to more accurate timing. And then what I'm also going to say about that, even though it's going to be available globally in midsummer, we're actually going to use it for our private preview. We're gonna give access to the select few that are joining our private preview, so that they can also engage some of their ConfigMgr devices in this deployment service capabilities and so on.
That's great. That's super awesome.
Yeah, we're really excited about that. We're very happy that we can allow ConfigMgr customers basically get a net new offering that really highlights the value of adopting the cloud without the, hey, but you also need to drag with you a lot of other servicing tasks that you don't necessarily feel like you're ready to move to the cloud. And this is the journey, right? That you talked about. Like, this is a journey that people want to take, as opposed to a journey that we're
imposing, right? We're forcing them, right? So you have to go, okay, you want to do this, but you have to like disrupt your whole SCCM environment. What I love about this, Nir, your approach here to this, is that you're meeting the customers where they are, right? So again, right, to highlight this, we're not disrupting and asking them, or even like it's a must for them to disrupt their own, their whole infrastructure, go to this new model, see if you want to leverage these new cool capabilities. I simply love this. And it really aligns also with our team, right? With Endpoint Manager. That's why we announced and made Endpoint Manager, Intune, and SCCM together, right? The co-management story that you framed, etc. I love this. This is great. Great approach.
So, I really want to give credit to Arya for changing our minds inside Microsoft that we should evolve co-management for these different update types, instead of keeping the Windows Update co-management workload the way that it is. I have to admit that I was an advocate for, hey, instead of breaking co-management into pieces, let's really invest in a cloud offering that gives you, the IT admin, all the capabilities that you need in parity to what exists in ConfigMgr, and create a compelling story that would allow admins to choose to adopt the cloud.
Right. No, this is great. Thank you, Arya, for helping us there and for partnering with us again there. Arya is awesome partner. Yeah, this is great to know. I love this. So before I go to the next questions, do you have anything else you want to cover?
The last thing that I'm going to say about the co-management scenario for broken down by content is that it's only going to be available for versions 2004 and on. And so you won't be able to turn on dual scan for drivers only unless you, at minimum, have what we call 20H1 or 2004, or the April 2020
That's
release.
Good to know. Okay, it's a very good point. Excellent. Just good news here. I love this. This is great. So I have a few more questions for you, Nir, before we close here. Let me see here. We talked about suspended updates. Yes. So will there be a schedule published somewhere on when the OEMs, the partners that you've been working with, right, are going to publish new drivers, like similar to the kind of the cadence that we have with Patch Tuesday, right? Are we going to have something specifically for drivers and firmware?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, think about the complexity of creating such an announcement when you have so many partners and they publish so frequently. And, think about an IHV like Intel creating a driver, but then sharing that driver with, say, Dell and Lenovo. And then Dell and Lenovo can modify some parts of that driver to make it more customized for their types of systems. And then Intel and Dell and Lenovo, they can all make multiple publishing events to Windows Update on different cadences for different purposes. And so trying to communicate that in some sort of a regular, like, it's very difficult. And in fact, I think it's not going to be useful. I think it's going to be more complicated for customers. Those hardware partners themselves, they publish regular bulletins and regular what's known BKCs, or best known configurations, through their own communication channels. And so, definitely IT admins, I think, would benefit greatly from subscribing to those. But what the deployment service brings is the ability to, hey, for your devices specifically, whenever the Windows Update service determines that there's a new update that is the right one, better than what's installed on your device for your devices specifically, it's going to appear in that catalog in Intune, and you'll be able to see it and make decisions. And so we see that as the mechanism to communicate to you when new updates are available for your devices.
I see. Now that's good. That's good to know. I think that's going to be a common question. If not, yeah, you're probably getting these questions already, right, from your private preview, etc. I think it's a good point of clarification for customers.
For sure.
Well, I think the next one, I think you already touched on, which is about how we're going to provide a solution. I can see this question coming a lot as well. I'm just going to highlight the question again, but I think you already answered really well. How we're going to make sure that's all or nothing with co-management today, right? Because today, when you're doing co-management, you want to switch the Windows Update workload to Intune, for example. It's all or nothing, right? And what you said that you and Ari are partnering on is about having a solution or more like a granular policy or control where we're going to have where SCCM admins will be able to just switch the drivers and firmwares to Intune and keep doing the rest with SCCM. I think you already answered that, but I just want to highlight this again because I've seen this question already. I think in your blog as well. I think someone asked that question there as well.
Yeah, it's definitely part of the messaging was that this is coming, and the way that that's going to look like, it's really going to be a group policy that you can set, and you'll be able to. It's a group policy you'll be able to access and set, and once you activate it, you know the last view that I saw, it's literally just shows you like 4 drop-down menus for feature updates and quality updates and drivers and firmware and other updates that sometimes are bucketed into the Windows Update category. And for each one of those, you'll be able to choose from a drop-down menu. Do I want to get it from WSUS or do I want to get it from Windows Update? And for example, in this case, for someone who wants to, hey, I'm going to open dual scan and I'm going to start scanning the cloud, but I only ever want to get driver updates from the cloud, you're not going to touch any of the other buckets. You're only going to go to drivers and firmware, and you're going to choose Windows Update in the drop-down menu. That will turn on dual scan, but would also guarantee that your devices would never be installing from the Windows Update service anything that is not just drivers and firmware.
I see.
And as a reminder, the driver and firmware updates that are going to be offered from the cloud would only be offered if you've created an approval and scheduling event in Intune that then gets recorded in the Windows Update service. And so you're not going to get anything until you actually approve it in Intune. So you do get that full control, approval, and schedule. You just get it from the cloud instead of WSUS.
Very good to know. Okay, this is awesome. Very good to know. Let me see here. Okay, so I think we can. We're coming to to close this conversation. It's great conversation here, by the way. I love it, Nir. Thanks for sharing all this good stuff with us here. What is next then? I don't know if before we go there, do you want to cover anything else before we talk about what's next for this feature?
Yeah, I think I will talk about just like one more
Sure.
thing that I know IT admins really care about, which is specifically like, hey, what happens when I have a driver that also requires an application to be installed
Good point.
with it?
Okay.
And so these are often called, HSAs or hardware apps. And the challenge with these apps, specifically for enterprises, is that the application that needs to be installed with the driver is usually published to the Microsoft Business Store. So there's like the App Store, and then there's the Business Store, right? And it's basically like it's the same app format, just for business usage. And then the mechanism in the OS that gets the driver and installs it also sees in the INF file for the driver, like, hey, you actually need, as part of the installation, to go fetch this app and install that as well. However, the problem is that a lot of IT admins choose to block the Business Store for enterprises, and so that step doesn't really work out. And so let me start by saying that, first of all, drivers can install successfully and function properly even without that app. And then that app can be installed either before or after the driver gets installed and still function properly with the driver if it's already there or when it arrives. So obviously, the obvious solution is, hey, turn on Microsoft Business Store so that you can get these applications. But again, we're not about to force anybody to do something that they're not feeling comfortable doing. I'm sure that admins have good reasons why they're not turning the store connection in enterprises. Sure. And so unfortunately, in the very, very first version, we don't really have a good solution other than, hey, be aware of the fact that you need that application. You can get that application and deploy it as a third-party application.
Okay.
Using the existing capabilities. But rest assured that I just wanted to call that out explicitly as something that I know is a pain point. I know that our story around that is not, ideal, and that we're putting our heads together inside of Microsoft to figure out a better solution. And again, I look forward to coming back here again in the near future and talk about what that solution is.
Love it. Okay, that's really good to know. Yeah, so wow, so it's a lot of exciting stuff. Really good conversation here, Nir. I think then I have a few questions for you kind of to close here with you. And what will be next then? Well, before we go there, how customers can sign up for, I know you mentioned this a couple of times, right? But how they can sign up for the private preview for this feature?
Yeah, so if you go to aka.ms/drivers-as-service, so drivers as a service with dashes in between all the words, or if you look at the Windows blog content, you can find the blog post that I posted at the beginning of March in conjunction with the Ignite session. At the bottom of that post, you will find a link that will allow you to join our engineering neighborhood. And then I think question number 5 asks you, hey, which program do you want to join? And it's called Driver and Firmware Update Private Preview. So it's pretty straightforward. Once you do that, you adhere to some GDPR privacy-related statements. And then within no more than a few days, you will be added to the Teams channel where all the other signees are there. Now, Thad and I provide a weekly update every Monday, usually. Just give folks an idea of like what we're doing and what we're, what are the next timelines, how's execution going, and then eventually we'll talk about best practices for firmware deployments, and we're going to share some early mockups and early prototypes and early views with you as well. And so I recommend doing that. Also, if you have a question that hasn't been answered here, it's a great way to ask that question and get answers, definitely from Thad and me, but also from the community of companies that we've been curating since the Ignite session was published. And so just in terms of timeline, we're targeting the launch of private preview in either May or June.
Okay.
And so as soon as Intune is ready to open the UX that is being implemented in the UI that they're building right now, we will then transition to public preview, and anyone with access to Intune will have the ability to use that. Now, as a reminder, again, midsummer, you're going to have the capability to turn on dual scan, but like private preview participants will have that ability from May, June already.
Cool.
In a kind of prior way. And then finally, if all goes well, and we're going to then, or we're targeting to launch this to everybody. So remove the preview moniker in late 21. I would say sometimes in the fall.
Okay, that's gonna be GA, right? Generally available, at least the plans, if everything goes well, generally available by the end of this year, essentially.
Yeah, and then a couple more things that I wanted to add, and hopefully this is not too much out of order, but like first of all, I know that this is the MEM Xperience, and so we've been focusing a lot about MEM, but I also want to mention that the deployment service is also going to be published to the Microsoft Graph, and it'll become available through certain licensing conditions to anyone who wants to build APIs directly and build on top of them.
That's good to know. Very good to know.
Other things that I hope it's okay that I'm like reminded of, like a couple other things that I want to say before we
absolutely go for it.
Good. We didn't really talk about reporting and
Oh,
analytics.
good point.
And it's not also showing in the demo. And so when we launch the private preview, we're gonna have basic reporting and analytics on how many drivers were downloaded, installed, succeeded, failed, what were the error codes, etc. And then definitely for a private preview, whenever Intune is ready, and then of course for GA, we're going to evolve our reporting and analytics story so that you can monitor driver and firmware deployments. You can monitor which devices receive those updates. Sure. And we're also looking into how do we evolve our reliability reporting for the impact of driver and firmware updates on given devices so that you can make approval and scheduling decisions on your future rings.
That's very good to know.
And so I just wanted
good reminder actually
to call that out. Yeah. And then the last thing that I'm reminded of right now, and again, it's not related to driver and firmware servicing, but I think it's important for folks to know. This technology, this expansion of the Windows Update service to include also the deployment service, we're starting with drivers and firmware. Sure. But it's really the foundation and the basis for every other content in Windows Update. And so, I can say now that security updates are coming. And the same level of approval and scheduling capabilities are coming. And in fact, for those of you who've attended or saw some of the digital Ignite sessions, one exciting feature that is coming from my team, my larger team, is David Geyer is the PM, and he's bringing expedited deployments for security updates. So for IT admins to be able to deploy a security update and then also say, hey, expedite this, and really trigger through the entire pipeline different behavior for how fast it gets downloaded, how fast the device will reboot, etc., just for that update. And so that's an example of another capability that is built on top of the deployment service, and you can expect additional security updates and quality updates controls to come that will be using the same capabilities here. And again, looking forward to come here in the future and talk about that when that becomes available. I would say early in 2022.
That's awesome, and that's a good reminder because Arya and I talked briefly about 0-day updates, right? Like those, like you have to get right out, right? Because it's a vulnerability fix that we release, etc. It's a great reminder for that as well. Maybe I have to have what's his name again? You mentioned.
David Geyer.
David Geyer. Probably have him in the podcast talking about this as well, as he's the feature owner for this, right? In your team.
He is. And in fact, he just accepted the position under Brian Keller. So he's going to be the Intune PM for Windows.
That's awesome. So yeah, he'll be in the team. So yeah, I will probably have him in the podcast to talk about that as well. Great reminder. Yeah. So what else, Nir? You keep sharing good stuff. I love it. Keep going.
Yeah. Honestly, like I think I've said everything I mean, maybe one more thing that I can add is, for everyone who read the blog, who saw the session, you also saw testimonials from some of our top partners that we're participating in. We had some passionate owners from Intel and HP and Dell and Lenovo definitely participate in the thinking about the deployment service. So we're collaborating with those top hardware partners, and specifically Dell, Lenovo, and Intel even recorded a testimonial that they wanted to share with the community and with the industry as we were announcing the deployment service for drivers and firmware. And you can see those testimonials in the blog post. And, I think it's important that to know, for us to execute in collaboration with the top hardware partners, but also for you to know that we're doing that. because they're the IHVs and OEMs, they're the publishers of that content.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll make sure also, Nir, to share a link in the description of this video with those videos as well, because I watched them. They're great. Yes, I loved seeing the partnership there as well. I'll make sure to note this in the description of this video as well.
Great.
All right. Anything else?
Well, that's all I had. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the engineering neighborhood, and I look forward to seeing you in the private preview and hear all about your experiences with the new deployment service for drivers and firmware.
Excellent, Nir. This is so exciting stuff. Very exciting. Love the conversation. Love everything that you shared here. It's very helpful for the community. Awesome work that you and team have done here. So excited with all this. Thank you so much for being in the podcast today. Great conversation. I see you soon then. You come back here in a couple of months to talk about some more exciting stuff that you're building. So
Definitely. Thank you very much.
All right. See you soon. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Bye.
See you next time.